My boyfriend Will and I have been together for almost 2 years. Admittedly, I thought the honeymoon stage was just a phase that would wear off soon. However, things have been running more smoothly than I expected. That was, until he got into a terrible accident. It was difficult for his mom to even get the words out on the phone. Through her sobs, she told me he was taking the train back home late at night when he accidentally fell into the train tracks. There were no witnesses. The security cameras weren't working that day either. All the police found were parts of his mangled and crushed up body, torn across the train tracks. I was trying my best to carry on without him. There was nothing to miss. He was dead and never coming back. Until I received a phone call at 3 in the morning. I answered, "Hello?" in a groggy voice. At first, all I could hear was heavy breathing on the other line. It was silent for a long time. Then an unfamiliar voice asked,
"Did you make it home?"
I sat up in my bed. Who is this? Then, the phone hung up. I looked at the number and realized it was Will's. He wasn't alive anymore. How was he calling me from beyond the grave? The next day, I asked his mom what happened to his phone after he was found. A look of grief overcame her face as she held her hand over her mouth. Then, she told me it was never found amongst the bloody mess. Will continued to call me, specifically at night. Creepy texts would replace the silent calls throughout the daytime. There were vague sentences like,
"Hello,
or simply,
where are you?"
Part of me began to resent Will for dying in the first place. If he never died, I wouldn't be getting terrorized every day. On a train ride home from class, I saw him. Will had his back facing towards me while looking out the moving doors. I tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned to me. His face looked nothing like the boy I fell in love with. He was an empty vessel, not my boyfriend. I looked him dead in his eyes, yet his face stayed emotionless. The doors opened, and Will stepped out onto the train station. I watched as he jumped onto the tracks, and his body was torn apart by the incoming train. I woke up with a jolt, still sitting in the train car. Looking around, I realized I was the last one left. Was Will ever actually here, or did I just imagine it? Judging by how the windows were no longer covered in his blood, I assumed the latter. As I laid in my bed that night, I imagined what it would be like if Will never died. Sure, there were parts of him I didn't like, but I never once wanted him to die. I texted Will's number and told him I'd like to see him where I saw him last. He didn't respond, but something told me he would be at the train station, waiting for me. I stood in front of the empty train station and admired the calmness. Then, footsteps from behind me broke the silence, and I turned around. When something emerged out of the darkness, I realized it was Will. He looked so perfect standing there. He reminded me of the moon, shining brightly, even being surrounded by total darkness. He captivated me completely, like always. I found myself remembering why I fell in love with him. He was still wearing the clothes I saw him in last. That night, he was going back home after our date, and I didn't want him to leave. I was begging for him to stay with me longer, but he lost his balance and fell onto the train tracks. It wasn't my fault. I began to walk towards him with open arms. "I can't live without you."
"Then die."
When I looked back up into his face, there was a corpse staring back at me. One of his eyes was completely crushed and falling out of its empty socket. It almost looked like a runny egg. Half of the skin on his face was completely torn off, revealing bare bones. Will pushed me back into the train tracks. Before I could stand up, I saw the headlights rushing towards me. My body was torn apart by the force of the speeding train. In my final moments, I realized Will was never actually there. I've been alone this entire time. none of those phone calls were real. Honestly, someone like me just wasn't meant to be saved. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I'm somehow posting this before Valentine's. I was inspired by this book I read called You've Reached Sam, and I really recommend it to you all as well. I hope all of you have a great February 14th, whether or not you're spending it by yourself or with someone else. So goodbye for now, but not forever.